you visualize something, what you're actually doing is you are reliving that moment. The thing about fear, it's usually not what we fear, it's the consequence. And I love asking this question whenever I interview any of these experts. What are your thoughts on fear? And he said, I believe that fear lives in the future.
Yeah. Emotion is a dancing leaf that passes. Can you explain a little bit?
Emotions in general, but mainly emotional pain, was never meant to remain. It is a messenger, a signal. It is a temporary visitor, but we treat it as a permanent resident in our bodies, and we tend to hold on to it.
So then is the exposure to the cause of the fear, or the perceived cause of the fear, always, or the only way to overcome it?
Not necessarily the only way to overcome it, because you can also use visualizations done in the right way. Because when you visualize something, what you're actually doing is you are reliving that moment. The thing about fear, because you touched upon that, so let me just clarify something. It's usually not what we fear. It's not the fear. It's the consequence. So when somebody says, I fear spiders, it's not that the spiders are the trigger, they're the fear. It's the consequence of being bitten by a spider. And that ties into what the pickpocket was telling me about when I was interviewing him. He talked about fear, and I love asking this question whenever I interview any of these experts. What are your thoughts on fear? And he said, I believe that fear lives in the future.
Yeah.
And I asked him, what do you mean by that? He said, well, think about it. You know, if you're in your home and you hear gunshots outside your home, you're not afraid of the gunshots. You're afraid of the gunmen coming into your home. And if they're already in your home, you're no longer afraid of them being in your home. You're afraid of them shooting you. And if they're shooting you, you're no longer afraid of them shooting, you're afraid of the shots.
Yeah.
So my understanding of what he said, and this is my analysis of it, because after he left, I was constantly thinking about it, is basically fear is a never-ending mirage that you keep chasing that never comes to fruition. And the other insight that I thought of was, if fear lives in the future and the future doesn't exist, then fear lives in a dimension that doesn't exist. And that just blew my mind.
From your perspective, how long did you spend with the samurai?
Oh, the samurai was, Japan was 19 days.
Yeah.
The samurai was about 2 days.
Cool. And
two whole days.
What was the biggest thing you learned whilst training with them?
There's a lot there. I learned, well, I did sword fighting. I did, on the second day, about 1 p.m., he told me, I don't know how it came about, but he was telling me that he is also grandmaster in Aikijitsu, or Aikido and Jiu-Jitsu came out of that martial arts. And I said, okay, we need to stop doing sword fighting. We need to get into this because we don't have that much time, and I'd love to learn more about that. And he started teaching me, and then I asked him about how he manages pain. And so he grabbed my arm, he grabbed my hand and twisted my wrist, and he said, does that hurt? And I said, yeah, it does. And he said, why? And I was like, because you're twisting it. He said, where are you focusing? What are you focusing on? And I paused for a moment. It took me by surprise. And I was like, I'm focusing on the wrist. And he said, you're focusing on the source of pain, and you're neglecting your entire body that is free. Can you move? And I said, no. And he said, how can you not move when your entire body is free? The only part of you that is trapped is your wrist. And he said, close your eyes, and I want you to imagine that pain traveling up your arm, moving all the way to the left hip. And I was like, okay. I closed my eyes and imagined it traveling to my left side, and I didn't feel the pain in the hip, but I no longer felt the pain in my wrist because I stopped focusing on it. Not only was I able to move him, Alex, I was able to push him, stand up and push him around. Yeah. And all I did was I stopped focusing on the wrist and on the pain and on the twisting that was happening, and I focused on everything else. My takeaway from that is, if you focus on the limitation, you're paralyzed. If you focus on the resources, the limitation takes care of itself.
It's interesting, because I'm just thinking now, so I go to physio regularly to just have various things done to my body to sort out ancient injuries that I've got. And just the other day, he was like, he had his elbow in the top of my shoulder, and it was like the most painful trigger point. Like at the time, it just felt like the most painful thing anyone could do to me in life. And I actually naturally, I can't remember where I picked this up from, but I started to think, actually, can I feel, my bum on the chair instead of focusing on that pain on my shoulder? And the more I tried to focus on my bum on the chair, the more the pain in the shoulders, the perceived pain in the shoulder subsided. And I kind of started to do that again. I was face down on his thing, and he had his elbow in my back of my leg, and more pain. So I started to focus on the pressure of my face and cheek against the little cushion. And again, the pain then subsided from where I thought it was to me focusing elsewhere, which I found quite interesting. I can't remember. I think I originally first started doing that when he was doing something to me one time, and it was just so painful. I was like, I can't handle this. But I know I needed to go through the pain to relieve the tension or whatever it was. But that aside,
can I elaborate on that? There are two things that came to mind related to that.
Yeah.
Number one, when you focused on your cheek, and the sensations, what you were doing to the unconscious mind was telling it what's important now.
Yeah.
This is important. My cheek is important. And automatically everything else became irrelevant, including the pain. The second thing is, if you focus on some other part of your body and that relieves the pain in another part of your body, how do you think that kind of mentality would affect your fear? When you focus on something else, the pain subsides. What if you focus on something else, like what you want? How do you think that affects the fear?
Yeah,
it would subside.
Same effect. Interesting that you kind of touched on the emotional connection to things, because one of the things that I pulled out from a lot of your amazing content on Instagram, which
it's very kind of you, thank you.
Is kind of a lot of the work that you do is kind of channeled into creating highly emotive, I guess, content through Instagram. One of the things I really pulled out was a quote. I wrote it down because I didn't want to forget it or butcher it, in which you said, "Emotion is a dancing leaf that passes." Can you explain a little bit about what you meant by that?
Well, okay, so emotional pain, or emotions in general, but mainly emotional pain, was never meant to remain. It is a messenger, a signal. It is a temporary visitor, but we treat it as a permanent resident in our bodies. And we tend to hold on to it. And the reason why we hold on to it is because if I hold a resentment towards someone, if I feel resentment towards someone, it's because of something the person did. It could be abuse or neglect. Now, holding on to the resentment won't hurt them, or won't hurt them as much as it would hurt me. But the reason why I'm holding on to the resentment is that how should I put it? Because you got resentment and guilt. Resentment is a way to protect myself from whatever happened to me from ever happening again.
Yep.
Guilt is a way to protect others from me doing that mistake again. So when I hold on to a guilt or hold on to resentment, I'm holding on as a reminder to make sure that whatever happened doesn't happen again. The problem is I end up suffering because the poison happens when I hold on to this. It was never meant for it to remain. It was meant to pass. And we kind of grab the leaf of emotion when it passes, and we hold on to it, and we press it in the ground, and we start forcing it to create roots, and then it becomes harder to release. Emotion can be considered like air. And if we allow it to pass, it will pass. If we hold on to it, it becomes liquid. It condenses, and then it freezes, it hardens. And the problem is a lot of people, especially men, do not cry. And that's one of the worst things you could ever do. So they hold on to their emotions, they suppress their emotions, and it turns from gas to liquid to solid. And it takes a long time for them to melt the emotions, because they need to melt now, and it takes time. But once you do, those men that didn't cry for a very long time will cry probably in an unstoppable way. And I'm sure you've seen clips of that. Suddenly there's this outpouring
Yeah.
of years
Yeah.
because the solid block of ice that they've been holding on to inside of them has melted, and now you have a waterfall. And it's not necessarily a never-ending waterfall. It just takes a lot of time to release everything you've been holding on to for decades.
Yeah.
So what I mean by that is emotions were never meant to remain. It was just meant to pass. It was never meant to remain inside you or inside anybody. It was meant to be released. It just passes. And if you're present, truly present, an emotion that you feel will pass. Because the moment it passes, it's like you're standing in the middle of a river and there's a leaf. It's going to pass you, and it's no longer going to hurt because it will pass. As long as you're not tethered to it with a harpoon.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people have a lot of leaves
Yeah.
connected to their back
Yeah.
that hold them back